Hello and welcome back to another episode of Majlis and Markets. I am your host Hassan. In this podcast, we aim to bring you thought-provoking conversations with influential leaders in Islamic and global markets. In our first episode for 2024, we're heading back to the Arab world and heading to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Since 2016, under the leadership of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia has been experiencing something of an economic and social transformation. At the heart of this shift is Vision 2030, an ambitious and visionary plan for a post-oil economy. This blueprint has brought about substantial reforms, touching every aspect of Saudi society, from economic diversification to societal norms. As the world's largest oil exporter, Saudi Arabia holds a unique position on the global stage. Its economic transformation has far-reaching implications, not only for the kingdom, but for the Middle East and the rest of the world. My guest today is a well-known figure in analysing Saudi Arabia's economy. Tim Callen is a visiting fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. He is a former assistant director in the Middle East and Central Asia Department at the International Monetary Fund. He served as the IMF's mission chief for Saudi Arabia and as the chief of the Gulf Cooperation Council's division from 2012 to 2021. He was responsible for the IMF's engagement with the government of Saudi Arabia and for the institution's research and publications on the country. He also led the IMF's research program on the GCC region. From 2021 to 2022, he served as the special advisor to the executive director for Saudi Arabia at the IMF's executive board. During our conversation, I spoke to Tim on several topics, including key reforms since 2016, as well as discussing the influence of the Public Investment Fund. We also touched on challenges facing the kingdom's economy, including the future of oil prices and climate risks. Tim Callen, welcome to Majlis and Markets. Good to have you here.
Very good to be here as well. Thanks for inviting me on your show.
Tim, you have a really interesting background, not just with Saudi Arabia, but with the International Monetary Fund. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you got into the IMF and then how you got interested in Saudi Arabia and this part of the world.
Yeah, sure. I mean, to be honest, I studied economics in England in the late 80s and, learned about the IMF during my studies. And, it always had an interest and thought it'd be a really great place to work, given, my interest in international economics and, sort of financial systems. So I started off initially working at the Bank of England, the Reserve Bank of Australia in the private sector in England. And then an opportunity came up in the early 90s to work at the IMF. And I, jumped at it, sort of thought it might be for a few years. It ended up being more like 30 years. Which I think, is a sign of, what an interesting place, for me it was to work. Then, I guess 10 years ago, I was, needed to move internally, and the opportunity came up to be the mission chief for Saudi Arabia and head of the Gulf Cooperation Council division. To be honest, I didn't know very much about Saudi Arabia or the region at that time, but I thought, it was a great opportunity to learn. So I took it and ended up doing pretty much 10 years in the job, became very, very familiar, particularly with Saudi Arabia, had the, great good luck to be there. I guess as Vision 2030, began to be implemented. So I really saw the before the reform period for a few years, and then the reform period, which was super interesting. The interaction between the IMF and the Saudi authorities got very close for a few years as the early parts of the reform were going on. So I count myself very lucky, to have worked at the IMF in general and to have worked on Saudi Arabia and the region, where I've learned so much, both about the economy, but also about, culture and society in the region. So very happy to talk more about, the reforms in Saudi.
No, absolutely. Before we get on to the reforms and the what's been happening over, say, the last 7 or 8 years, what was Saudi Arabia's economy like before 2016? Would you have said was it very different to what it was in 2016?
Yeah, I mean, I think both the economy, but more broadly the experience of visiting Saudi, I think was very different before 2016. So clearly the economy itself was very very dominated by oil. Of course, it's still very reliant on oil even now. But I think, you can certainly see some signs of the reforms working and moving, at least some degree away from oil. But, I would say visiting Saudi before 2016 was quite an unusual experience for somebody coming from, the European,
Yeah, it was
US
very difficult.
background.
Very difficult.
Yeah, and it was very, you know, little entertainment, right?
Mm.
Sort of little in the way of really, some restaurants and coffee shops, but not as anywhere near what you see now. Hard to do, tourism activities when you were there in that period. Of course, very few women in the workplace. We came across very few women working in the government before the 16, 17 period. Now you see women working both the private sector and government sector more broadly, and that's true of young Saudis. I think generally you'd see very few young Saudis working in the private sector before 2016, 17. Now you see them much more in retail, hospitality, and so on. So yeah, I mean, for somebody visiting Saudi now, for the first time, I think it's probably very difficult to appreciate the extent of the reforms that have actually gone on there.
Yeah, no, I think before 2016, like unless you were going for a religious pilgrimage or a religious tourism, if you want to call it that, and if you're a business person, like in the construction services or something specific to do with another Saudi counterpart, I don't think most people would have considered going to Saudi Arabia. But as you said, since 2016, 17, it's when the country is really beginning to open up. Speaking of 2016, 17, what are your thoughts on the Saudi economy today? Like, do you think it's an improving picture? Before we get into like the more specifics of like the economy opening up.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely an improving picture, right? I mean, if you look at things like employment and the unemployment rate, they've come down. You're seeing more women working, as I said before.
Mm,
Some signs, I think, of the beginnings of diversification. I mean, I think in reality it's still early days, but certainly take the tourism sector, which I've actually been looking at a little bit of the data the last week or so, and you really do see some pretty significant growth in the tourism sector. Now, of course, you could argue that it's the government doing a lot of investment to get the sector off the ground, which I think is true.
mm,
But it's also, you're definitely seeing in the numbers, more people visiting Saudi Arabia, more, spending from those visitors. And indeed, Saudis as well, I think, doing more tourism in their own country than was the case before. So I think that's one obvious area where things have improved. You're beginning to see clearly development in the mining sector. Of course, petrochemicals has always been quite a strong area, but probably further sort of growth in that area as well. You can always argue whether is that really non-oil? Is it too related to oil? But it's adding value, I think, above the clearly the crude and refined oil products that have been I guess more traditional in Saudi. So yeah, I mean, I think definitely seeing signs of change, but I think it's very easy also to underestimate the degree of challenge it is to diversify a country like Saudi Arabia. And I think my own view is there are no examples of countries that have been so reliant on oil, still with very big oil reserves and high production levels, who've successfully diversified. So this is not going to be a 5 to 10 year period to diversify. I think it's a 20 to 30 plus
like a
year period. Yeah,
generational.
yeah,
And like,
absolutely.
and you said like, I think Saudi Arabia compared to say some of its other Gulf neighbors is a little bit different because it has a larger indigenous population than compared to say like the UAE or Qatar or
Yeah,
some of these other
yeah.
countries. But Tim, when this all began in 2016 with Vision 2030, what is Vision 2030 and why is it important?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question, right? Because you know, at the end of the day, what Vision 2030 is trying to achieve is, I think, this diversification away from oil on the economic side, um, but also really a change in the Saudi society as well, in terms of sort of moving away from I think what was in many ways was quite restrictive before Vision 2030 came out, to one where you're seeing more entertainment options, right? More ability for to people to get out and enjoy their own country, more leisure, entertainment, sport opportunities. So it really is a transformation, beyond the economics. I'm probably only qualified to talk about or if I'm qualified to talk about anything, I'm qualified to talk about the economic side of it rather
Mm,
than the broader thing. But I think it's sort of a very, very ambitious program.
mm,
Clearly, probably that level of ambition was needed because it really needed to kickstart something to really make change, where things had not really changed up until 2015, 16 for many years. Whether the scale of ambition can be fully met, I don't know, but I think it's clearly has worked in terms of moving the economy in the right direction, but with much more work to still do.
yeah. I think like with Vision 2030 when it was unveiled by the now Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, um, it's definitely a radical or a extensive socio-economic plan, as you mentioned, and it's jump-starting the private sector and social liberalization in Saudi Arabia, which has long been uh, a needed thing in the country, to involve the women in the workforce and to have a more diversified economy. Um, what were some of the key initiatives that were under Vision 2030 that you think that were important?
Well, I would say you can probably break it up into a number of groups, right? I mean, first one was clearly to try and reduce the reliance of the economy and oil in a number of ways, right? One, on the fiscal side, to move the revenue system to get more taxes from non-oil sources. So the introduction of the value-added tax, excise taxes on cigarettes and sugar sweetened beverages.
So like a
Um,
syntax, yeah, like a syntax.
yeah, the
Yeah.
syntaxes, yeah. And then also, to sort of rationalize and try and make more efficient the government spending side, which certainly I think in the period from, 2011 to 14 had really grown very sharply,
Mm.
with not a lot of evidence that particularly the investment side was really very efficiently generating any economic growth. So, I think, the first side is maybe, the fiscal, to put the fiscal on a more solid footing.
Mm.
Um, the second angle was definitely sort of, to try and encourage growth in the non-oil
Mm.
sector by sort of identifying and developing new sectors of the economy but also I think a general analysis of what is what constraints in the legal system, the regulatory system, and so on may be holding businesses back. So I think there's been clearly a big effort in terms of efforts to try and sort of improve the efficiency with which people can get licenses, right, through the whole use of digital technology and so on. And then the third angle, I guess, is sort of maybe more on the sort of social economic sort of edge, where you clearly had the sectors of entertainment and so on that weren't there before. You've had reforms to enable, as you said, women to participate more in the economy, and I think more broadly in society. And if you look at the increases in the female participation rate, it's virtually doubled right over the last 6 years, or maybe
Yeah,
over
absolutely.
doubled over the last 6 years. And when you look at the data, you see, clearly more Saudi women than men at university. On these international, educational test scores, women tend to do better than men in Saudi. So, you're bringing in, I think, a motivated, skilled group of the population into the workforce now, which, weren't able to, play a full part before. And that's undoubtedly going to help you in terms of moving towards a more productive, higher growth economy over time. I think in most of these areas there's still more to go, even if there've been big changes in a quite a short period of time.
Mhm.
But I think all of these are in the right direction.
Yeah, just going to your point about women in the workplace, I have an anecdotal example. I went to Saudi Arabia in 2017 and 2018, and I had a meeting with one of the banks, and I was just astounded how many Saudi females were working, not just as tellers, but in like senior management positions as well. I'm not sure like if that would have been like a common sight back in 2011, 12, 13, compared to
Yeah,
say like today. But yeah, no,
yeah.
definitely the females are
I
more.
think that that's right. That I think if you go back to the pre-reform period, most women who were working were probably in education and healthcare. Um, but you've seen that branch out, right? And you're seeing more in finance, in retail, in hospitality, and so on. And that's I think what you would expect to see, right? Given the the education levels of sort of Saudi women, that you would expect to see them broadly across the economy. You're seeing clearly more women in leadership positions, although maybe still like many places in the world, not as much as you would, you would expect. And I think there's probably, much further to go in terms of women getting up into senior leadership and management positions. And, in some ways this becomes a virtuous circle, because I think as there are more role models available, right, and people can see that women do get to these positions, it provides more incentive for younger women just entering the workforce, or even middle-aged women entering the workforce, to see that there are opportunities, and people who understand what they are looking for through the employment relationship with their employers.
Yeah, and definitely, I think like the reforms such as allowing women to drive and more social mobility has probably helped propel that. One area that Vision 2030 had was the development of the capital markets. I think Saudi Arabia's capital markets, and I'm sure you can talk about this. They've opened the capital markets a lot in the last, say, 5 or 6 years. I remember working as a young bond reporter in 2013. And we never used to get any. I think Saudi electricity was the only issuance back in the day of like and then that was it for the year. But now you're seeing Saudi Arabia issue a lot of bonds in the market. You're seeing them borrow from the syndicated loan market. You're seeing the domestic capital markets. The equity market
Yeah.
there is very active. How much of a was is the financial sector a part of Vision 2030?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge part of it, right? And it's clearly one of the vision realization programs is on the financial sector development. And you're right. If you go back, I mean, actually, when we started, I guess it was late 2015, started discussing reforms with the Saudi government. Of course, all they were doing on government debt side was paying the returns on debt that had been issued probably a decade or more beforehand. There was no body in the Ministry of Finance or elsewhere who would have been capable at that time of doing a bond issuance. So it was really for them, I think, starting from scratch and establishing what now is the debt management center, and putting in place the skills and the staff to be able to to run a government bond issuance program. Um, so I think one side is clearly on the government that they're issuing both domestic sukuk internationally. So that's a big change. Then of course you've got PIF issuing as well, Aramco borrowing. So I think that's really changed. Then on the equity side, as you said, you've got well, both on the primary market, you've had foreign investors being able to come in. You've had the Aramco IPO. You've had the Nomu secondary or smaller market ride come out. So
Would you say the Nomu is similar to the UK's AIM market?
yeah, I think that's right. It's sort of like sort of a market for companies that may not meet the listing requirements right on on the main exchange, but still need to I guess are big enough that they're not in the venture capital space. They need something in between. Um, and so I mean, I think when you take this outside of the government, then you have more options, right, for the corporate sector to look at, both through sukuk issuance, equity issuance. It's no longer really just on the banks, or on or on other sources of finance. I mean, to be honest, I haven't looked at the data in terms of issuance for the corporate sector in the last couple of years. So I don't know how much of this is being taken up by them, but it's clearly the infrastructure is there, much more so than than it was again, 5, 6, 7 years ago. Of course, there is an element, of course, where you now have more foreign investors involved, and with that come some additional risks as well as benefits in terms you're going to be more subject to the whims over time of foreign investors. Maybe a little less stable investor base than the domestic investors, but clearly the benefits of being able to access foreign money either issuing overseas or having those investors come domestically is very important.
Yeah, no, I think also the entrance of these international banks like Standard Chartered and I
Yeah,
think Citi, which has a interesting history in Saudi Arabia. And they left in 2006 and then came back, or trying to come back and set up a presence. Well, I think they do have a presence in Saudi and some of these other. And then also I think like other Gulf countries, there's been a lot of consolidation of the banking sector in Saudi. So you
yeah,
saw, I think it was a merger that made Saudi National Bank, which is now I think the largest bank in Saudi, or the second largest bank in Saudi Arabia after Rajahi. So
yeah.
yeah, I think definitely there's more foreign capital coming in. There's one thing I wanted to ask you about. You mentioned Aramco. How important was the Aramco IPO in Vision 2030? I know at the time when Mohammed bin Salman was presenting or unveiling the Vision 2030, he mentioned that Aramco is a very important part of this, and that the IPO from Aramco would be an important financial um, an important financial mechanism to help finance a lot of these projects he was presenting. How
Yeah.
much how did that have a big impact on Saudi Arabia?
I mean, I would say it has, two impact, right? I mean, one is there was clearly a demonstration effect from, I think, the IPO of Aramco, in that, the transparency of Aramco had to increase, and the scrutiny on Aramco has clearly increased with that greater transparency. So in terms of the desire of the reforms to sort of push maybe a more private sector mindset, greater transparency on the economic side, then I think it's been important from that point of view. Secondly, it did raise money that ultimately has been reinvested elsewhere by the PIF. So I guess you can argue it's part of a diversification strategy as well. So I would say those two things. Ultimately, the money raised by through the IPO was nowhere near what was originally planned, right? And clearly, the ideas of an international issuance had to be scaled back, and it was issued just domestically. Now, I think the other interesting thing with with Aramco, right, is that 8% of the company's now been given to the PIF, and while that helps the size of the PIF balance sheet, and maybe we ultimately will be able to help them claim that they're the world's largest sovereign wealth fund at some point in the future. Really, that equity is sitting on the PIF balance sheet, and it's really hard for them to do anything in terms of liquidating that. So they benefit from getting the dividends off of that equity, which is clearly important for financing part of their new investments. But really, it's transferring a relatively illiquid asset from the government to the PIF with at least in my view, no benefits beyond the dividends, and potentially giving the PIF more borrowing power because of that larger balance sheet.
Yeah, and speaking about the PIF, I know you've written extensively about this over the past couple of months. PIF, has been around since the 1970s, but it only really took off in 2015-16 when Mohammed bin Salman came onto the scene, and obviously it's increased its AUM, and it's increased its presence in the economy, and it's also, done a lot of buying assets such as, the Newcastle football club, and it's done a bunch of other bought a bunch of other assets around the world. How important is the PIF, and how important is it to Saudi Arabia's economic diversification?
I mean, I think it's really important, right? I mean, it's the really the driving force of a lot of the investments that are going on under Vision 2030. Both in terms of the the efforts to diversify the domestic economy directly by projects in the domestic economy, and then also through its investments overseas, at least some of which I think are designed right for either a technological transfer or some other transfer back into the kingdom. Now, I think the thing with the PIF is, of course, a lot of it has been funded by transfers from elsewhere in the public sector. So we've clearly had the Aramco equity transfer. We had transfer out of the SAMA's reserves in early 2020. I think an earlier transfer out of the government reserve deposits. So a lot of what's going on is shuffling assets from one part of the public sector to another, but clearly the PIF is taking a more aggressive posture in terms of where those assets are being invested and seeking a higher rate of return, whether that's a purely financial rate of return or a broader economic rate of return in the sense of developing new sectors of the economy with the jobs and presumably ultimately at some point in the future the tax benefits that will give to the country. But I think the bottom line is the PIF is one of the if not the key player in the reforms.
As an economist, wouldn't you say that that means that there's inorganic economic growth, that a lot of this is being driven by the government and not coming from the private sector?
Yeah, I think that's definitely one of the challenges here, and I think you can argue that the central government has maybe become less important to the economy over the past 5 years, but the PIF has become much more important. And where does that leave the overall public sector role in the economy now relative to a decade ago? I think it's hard to be precise because there's still probably not enough details of the PIF's operations to make that clear. But I very much doubt it's declined over that last decade. So I think maybe the question then is, are the investments the PIF is making, are they going to be able to exit those investments at some point in the future to then bring the private sector in? And that is something, certainly they're saying that is the plan and that is what they'll do. But I think time will tell how easy that is. It is to
Yeah.
do. And yeah.
Because like I was just thinking about I think the Saudi authorities, they talked about foreign direct investment figures at the end of last year, that they changed the methodology or the calculation and that it actually increased. But I'm just wondering, like, how much foreign direct investment is there in Saudi Arabia, and what do you
Yeah.
think the investor perception is of the Saudi business environment?
Yeah, I mean, so I think if you look at the data that was published, as you say, late last year, it shows some pickup right in the last couple of years. But if you strip out the I think there were two deals for oil and gas pipeline in 21 and 22, two separate deals. I think if you strip those out and try and look at non-oil FDI, then the pickup is probably much less than the headline numbers shows. I think this area is still a little confusing as well, because while those new numbers came out in a SPA press release, if you look at SAMA's data for the balance of payments, they're not incorporated into that data yet. So, we'll have to see, I guess, when and how that incorporation is done. But more broadly on the question, you know, my sense is that the foreign investors look at Saudi Arabia as a really good investment opportunity, but there are still questions about navigating the business environment, the tax environment, how how you get into the country in terms of an investment opportunity. Do you need to partner with the PIF in sectors they're in? How does that work in terms of a level playing field? And then I think there are always going to be questions as well. Is while Saudi Arabia itself is very stable, the region is much less stable, and particularly so at the moment. So I think for many businesses as well, they maybe start big picture and work down, look at the Middle East, then look at within the Middle East. And there are I think certainly at the moment there are going to be questions about what is the short-term direction the region is going to take. So I think there are a number of sort of specific economic issues, and there may be broader geopolitical issues that could still be holding foreign investment back.
I think they've been trying quite hard to improve the business environment in Saudi Arabia. I think there was an article, I think, in the Financial Times at the end of last year, which talked about the UAE, liberalizing more to attract tourists and foreign investors and foreign
Yeah.
businesses. I think Saudi Arabia is trying to do the same thing. One thing that came to my mind just now was I think obviously Saudi Arabia passed this law that if you want to do business with the kingdom, you have to base your headquarters in the kingdom. How much of an impact do you think
Yeah.
that will have on the business environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question because, you know, at least from what I can see, is actually really hard to know what the policy really means. I haven't seen a good explanation of what actually constitutes a regional headquarters. How do you define what a regional headquarters is? Maybe you have more details on this than I do, but it seems to me there's a little bit of a lack of clarity about exactly what this policy is going to mean.
Yeah, I think
Um,
I think like 'cause I was talking to a lawyer about this at the end of last year, and he basically said to me it meant that the CEO of the law firm goes to Riyadh and stays there, Sunday to Thursday, and then he can head back to Dubai, whilst the actual proper work or the actual work done by lawyers or bankers is done in another country, say like the UAE. But because
right,
the registered
right.
head office is in Saudi, but I don't know if that's the correct characterization. Uh,
Yeah, it would. I think it would be useful, both for analysts, but even more so for the businesses if the authorities would publicly clarify what
yeah.
exactly is expected under this policy. Because I think it's another question. So let's say I'm a new business, looking to go into Saudi Arabia, and I want to bid on a government contract. Um, let's say I already have a regional HQ in Dubai, which I'm very happy with. Um, if I want to bid on that government contract in Saudi, what does that mean for my regional HQ? And it's something that again, and maybe it's only at the margin, but maybe it's more than that. Could be something that's holding back FDI. So you may have, it's not clear to me which way, do you get a positive benefit out of this, or does it actually, have a negative impact because people hold back on the investment side because of concerns or lack of clarity on this area. And at the end of the day, I think what you want is the FDI coming in, and if you can, work out with the companies, what is holding back the FDI, then, maybe that's a way to go. But I think, you raise another interesting point because I think, more broadly on the reforms, it's really important to bear in mind that, Saudi Arabia has done a huge amount of
Mm.
reform, but, other countries in the region aren't standing still either. Right. And, as you say, UAE in particular, I think has been doing a lot as well to improve the business environment, attract skilled workers into the country.
Mm.
And at one level, the competition between countries is good because maybe it pushes both to reform more. But on the other side, if you're trying to attract business away from your competitor who's reforming at least as much as you are, then it becomes, you can't just look at what you're doing. You've got to look at it relative to what they're doing as
No,
well.
absolutely. Yeah, I think like another question I had with regards to this is like these projects that Saudi Arabia is doing, like NEOM and the Red Sea project. The Red Sea project, for example, is a big tourism project that they're trying to do, and how are they going to compete against the likes of Dubai and Bahrain and Oman, and even Qatar to that extent?
Yeah.
They're all trying to attract tourists to their countries.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would say two things. I mean, one, the global tourism market is pretty big,
Mm.
right? So, I mean, I think in this area, there is probably enough tourists to go round if you're putting on a good product. And, you know, I don't know a lot of the details, but my sense is the Red Sea project is quite different to, the tourism you'll probably get in most of the other countries. So I think that would be advantageous. but again, you're right in the sense that, while there are a lot of global tourists, it's also a very competitive market.
Mm.
Right, so you've got to put a good product, and good product for the price on the market, and that's ultimately, I guess, where we'll have to see where Saudi is able to go with some of these really big developments.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I remember talking to a tourism analyst a few months ago, and I asked him like, what do you think about Saudi Arabia? And he goes, look, the clientele that Saudi is trying to attract is a bit different to, like, say, the people that visit Dubai. Has its own place, and it's very well known for being a tourism hotspot in the Middle East, whereas Saudi, it's a bit more unknown in the sense, other than religious tourism or religious pilgrimage. They're trying to attract a different kind of clientele, those that go to Dubai or Bahrain or Oman or Qatar. So yeah, I can see they're trying to tap that market, which come
Yeah.
with the PIF. What are your thoughts on them buying sports teams like Newcastle, and doing things with the Live Golf, and they're talking about the UFC hosting boxing matches in Saudi Arabia. Why is the PIF doing this, do you think?
Well, I mean, there's clearly a desire under Vision 2030, right, to be in the sports area. And I guess I would say, for two reasons, right? One is there is an interest in, I think, getting the Saudi population to be more active
Mm.
themselves. I think inactivity, diabetes and related illnesses have, and are an issue in Saudi. And, I think the other thing is clearly Saudi wants to be seen as a player on the global stage. And these high profile sporting events, I think, are part of that strategy. And if you look, right, you got I don't know whether it's yet been confirmed, but Saudi for the 2034 World Cup, I
Yeah.
think the
Yeah.
Asian Games, right? I mean, well, Expo, more broadly in
I mean, they beat
sort of
Argentina in the World Cup.
entertainment.
They beat Argentina in the World Cup, so they were probably really happy
Yeah,
about that.
yeah. No, that's right. That was a huge result for them. But there is clearly you know a big interest in the Saudi and in the region in soccer, right? I mean,
Mm.
both sort of locally, but maybe also more so in terms of the international soccer scene. Um, you know, Newcastle's. I mean, I have to say, I'm a huge Premier League fan. So, I mean, I guess I have my views on this, but
Which team do you support? Which team do you
I
support?
support Arsenal.
Oh, you support
So,
Arsenal. Okay. Okay.
yeah. So, you know, my sense is, the PIF probably got quite a bargain with Newcastle. I mean, I think
Mm.
they paid like, was it 300 million or something around
Yeah,
that? And
I think it was a consortium
um,
that they went through, right? They didn't buy
it's a
it outright.
consortium,
Yeah.
yeah, but they have the majority
Yeah.
share, right? And you look at Newcastle. I mean, it's a hugely well supported, very dedicated supporter base. Um, soccer mad area of England up in
Mm.
the northeast. And then you look at I mean, of course, Manchester United are a bigger club,
Mm.
but you look at the price that Jim Ratcliffe paid to get a quarter of Manchester United. I suspect in 5 to 10 years, the investment in Newcastle might look, a pretty shrewd bit of business by the PIF.
Mm.
Um, Now, whether there's any, sort of economic return in terms of the investments that have been made bringing high-profile players into Saudi Arabia, I think is probably a more open question. But again, it's generating interest locally, and I think it's clearly this is beyond just a financial investment that's going on, but it's an investment trying to get the interest, get high profile events, and sort of appealing to the Saudi population in terms of the broader sporting environment.
Yeah, no, definitely. Tim, as we bring the podcast to a close shortly, what are some of the challenges Saudi Arabia is going to be facing in 2024? I mean, lower oil prices. Do you think that's probably the most immediate challenge to the Saudi economy?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the oil market is certainly an area, I would say, of uncertainty right at the moment. If you look to last year, we saw, a big surge in US oil production, Saudi, particularly having to cut production to support the price, the price level. How that plays out, given the tensions in the region, I guess is not clear to me at the moment. But my guess would be if suddenly the conflict was to stop, probably prices are going to fall unless there are further production cuts or some other unexpected
Do you
development.
think we've been at peak oil? Do you think peak oil is here, or?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that, and I think that you know, I I guess if you look at OPEC's forecasts, they would say continued growth, right? If you look at the IEA, probably a much earlier peak. I think that's going to be very hard to call. But I think what well, two things matter, right? Is Saudi, at least at the production level, has very low cost production, so it's going to be one of the last countries, standing in terms of production. But on the other side, it is still very reliant on oil revenues, and even if you're seeing flat oil revenues at a high level, it's really the growth in those revenues that allows you to grow government and PIF spending over time. So even a flat oil revenue environment is going to make it more difficult, I think, on the spending side for the government. I think there are a number of other things, I mean, that I'm, looking at for this year. I mean, I think one is, we spoke about female labour force participation rates, which have increased, hugely. But if you look at the last couple of years, it's sort of been a much flatter trend around 35, 36%. So the question
Why
is,
is
have we
that?
seen?
Why
And
now?
that, I think, is an excellent question. I don't have an answer, and I'm looking to see whether that upward trend reasserts itself this year or not. Because I think if you have another year where you don't make any further gains, then there are questions about, has this actually plateaued? Whereas, I feel quite optimistic on this because I think Saudi Arabia still has scope for that participation rate to increase, whether it reaches a global average of around 50%, but I think it should be going up towards that level. I think a second interesting area is going to be what happens to tourism. I say we've seen really big growth in 2023, late 2022, 2023. Does that continue in 2024? FDI we've spoken about is, are we going to see a pickup in FDI? It's going to be harder if we've seen no pickup by the end of this year to not then start having, I think, more questions about, are there issues in the business environment that is really holding back this investment? And then the last thing which we haven't really touched on is, right at the end of this year, there's there's this 4-year thing called the Trends in International Science and Mass Scores, TIMS, which do these globally comparable tests of, I think it's 5th and 8th graders. And, for the level of spending Saudi has on education, those scores have always been very disappointing. We've seen education reform beginning in the last, since the last test was done. So I'm going to be looking quite closely and with interest when these, test results come out at the end of this year, whether we're beginning to see any improvement. Because I think at the end of the day, and why diversification is such a long-term process, is you've really got to develop the human capitals and the skills in science, technology, maths that are really going to be at the crux of the sort of economy and industries that Saudi wants to develop over the time. So without seeing these improvements in human capital, I think it's going to be hard to sustain the reforms over the longer term.
Mm. Tim, I have two other questions. The first is, what are your thoughts on Saudi Arabia's trade relations with China? Obviously, I think China is the number one buyer of Saudi oil,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of investment between the two countries. How much? What do you think China's impact will be on the Saudi economy compared to, say, the US, for example?
Yeah. Well, certainly, as you say, a lot of oil goes to China. I mean, I guess still ultimately oil is a global market, right? The price at least is, although there are, sort of surpluses, discounts on the price to particular areas of the world. But I think the investment relationship has probably strengthened the last few years. I think another area is tourism. I mean, I suspect that a growing number of tourists from China and probably from Asia are going to be seen coming to Saudi Arabia in the coming years. So I suspect that's another area that will develop, and then probably in terms of, the travel relationships and, flights between the countries, you'll see that develop, and maybe, more investments from China into Saudi in, tourism, transport. I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see those.
And do you think that Saudi will still be a key trade partner with the US, or do you think that's going to be changing anytime soon?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think Saudi and the US, Saudi will remain, or sorry, the US will remain very important for Saudi Arabia, right? For economic and broader reasons. Clearly at the moment, even while trade is going more to China and Asia, real is still pegged to the US dollar,
Mm.
so monetary policy in the US is hugely important for Saudi. Clearly trends in the dollar are important for Saudi, given the desire to develop tradable sectors in goods and services.
What about like
Yeah,
things? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you, but the things like about there's a bit of confusion whether Saudi's actually joined BRICS or not. Um, so
yeah.
I think the minister he said they're not technically a member of BRICS. This
Y-
whole
y-
thing about de-dollarization with Saudi Arabia, even though they're pegged to the dollar. I mean, what are your thoughts there?
Well, I mean, I think take the BRICS, whether they're joined or not. Clearly there has been strengthening economic relations with countries in the BRICS and associated with the BRICS in recent years. And you're also seeing, right, the India, Middle East, Europe corridor. So I think there are a whole host of things where you know through various mechanisms, international cooperation and Saudi's you know involvement in the global economy beyond maybe just oil is going to strengthen. um it's de-dollarization, you know I think is a long way off, to be honest. I mean, oil is priced in dollars for a reason, and the reason is that it's a liquid market, right? And it's
Mm.
very hard to, you can do bilateral transactions in other currencies, for example, but ultimately the price is going to come off oil. The dollar price of oil. I think how these transactions are priced, even if they're settled in other currencies, across you know, treasuries, US equity markets, commodities, the US and dollar is, still king, I
Mm.
think. And I just don't see that changing in the foreseeable future to any great degree.
Yeah, there was an article by Bloomberg, I think, sometime last year, and they showed where majority of Gulf sovereign wealth fund money was going to, and even though as you said, China's and Asia's influence is growing, or the trade relations are growing with the likes of Saudi Arabia, majority 70% or 80% of all the money went to the U.S. equity market, or the U.S.
Yeah,
equities, U.S. stock market. So
yeah,
yeah, the U.S. is not going anywhere
yeah,
anytime soon, or Gulf
yeah.
money into the
I
U.S.
mean, if you want, guarantee of liquidity and being able to get your money out, right, then I think the US is
It's
clearly
still
the
a good
place
bet.
you're
Yeah,
going to
no,
invest.
definitely. And
Yeah,
Tim, the other question I had, which I think has been on the agenda of a lot of people over the last couple of months, is post COP28 is the climate. What are your thoughts on climate risks to Saudi Arabia and their impact on the Saudi economy going forward?
right. I mean, I guess I would take this question in two parts, right? I mean, one is, climate risks to Saudi Arabia itself, which I think are quite significant given, you know, water issues, right? Temperature is already very high. If that goes up, it becomes, more difficult to live, more difficult to do business in. Um, so I think there is an issue that needs to be addressed from Saudi Arabia's perspective here. Um, then secondly, the impact that climate change or climate mitigation could have on the global oil market and so on, and affect the primary source of income. Um, I mean, I think eventually it's going to happen, right?
Mm.
But I'm not convinced myself that we're sort of near the peak in oil demand, or even if we're near the peak, it's not going to fall away particularly quickly. Maybe I should put it that way. Um, and then even in that environment, what happens to price is going to depend on what happens to investment in the sector, right? And do we see, even if demand slows, if investment isn't going in, maybe supply will fall away even more sharply. So I think it's difficult to call in the 10 to 20-year window what happens for oil revenues for Saudi Arabia. Maybe longer term, the trend is definitely going to be down. And then the other thing is investments in alternate energy,
Mm.
where I think Saudi and the rest of the Gulf are clearly, in terms of solar, wind, are probably in a pretty good position to develop these alternate sources, and they have the capital in most of the countries to invest in these sectors as well. So clearly that is going to be an area where they are going to make investments, maybe along with carbon capture technology and so on, to sort of mitigate some of the the direct impact that a decline in or the move away from emissions from fossil fuels will cause for them.
Great. And Tim, what are your plans or what are you researching these days now that you've left the IMF for a while?
Yeah. Well, I'm in the fortunate position where I can pretty much pick and choose, what topics I'm looking at the moment. So, um, I guess things I'm interested in at the moment is trying to do a bit more work on the Saudi tourism sector, where I think there is a lot of change going on, and I was actually pleasantly surprised when I looked actually how much data is available as well. So that's something I wanted to look at. I think the global oil market is an area of interest as well to me, to try and see a bit more carefully what may be going on, likely to go on this year. Um, Investment, I think, is a really important area. Not only FDI, but domestic investment. They have the national NIS, national investment strategy. I may not have the words quite correct, but I think looking at that is going to be interesting, just to see what the trends in investment and the efficiency investment have been. And then I think also I'd like to do something more detailed on the labour market, and particularly look at the growth of female employment and labour force participation, but more broadly the growth of Saudi employment, where it's taken place, what have been the factors, how sustainable it is. So those are a few things that hopefully in the next few months I will get something written on.
Great. Great. Tim Callen, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed the discussion.